Well, hello there, Space Monkeys. Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. In this episode, we're going to be continuing Blackshirts and Reds, Chapter 7, The Free Market Paradise Goes East, Part 2. Already read Part 1. That's in two different parts itself. You can check those out. They're about 15, 20, 25 minutes each. This will be similar, broken down into two parts. This first part is going to be talking about how privatization in previous communist countries has absolutely caused wealth inequality to skyrocket, and what the real-world implications of privatization of a system like that causes. What they lost in terms of education, how there's, no investment in infrastructure. There's a wealthy few that do very well, but then you lose things like healthcare and education, and even entertainment took a dive when privatization moved in. So you're going to notice a lot of similarities, parallels, if you will, between what they're talking about in now more capitalized countries, more privatized countries that were previously somewhat communist or socialist. So we're going to be starting on page 105 here. The Free Market Paradise Goes East, Part 2. Free market propagandists in former communist countries claimed that as capital was privatized and accumulated in a few hands, production would be stimulated and prosperity would be at hand. But first, there would be a difficult period to go through. This quote-unquote difficult period is proving to be far more severe and protracted than predicted, and may well be the permanent condition of capitalist restoration. For vipers and bloodsuckers. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was preparing for its fatal plunge into the free market paradise, Bruce Gelb, head of the United States Information Agency, told a reporter that the Soviets would benefit economically from U.S. business education because, quote, the vipers, the bloodsuckers, the middlemen, that's what needs to be rehabilitated for the Soviet Union. That's what makes our kind of country click. Today, the former communist countries in China are clicking away with vipers and bloodsuckers. Thousands of luxury cars have appeared on the streets of Moscow and Prague. Rents and real estate prices have skyrocketed. Numerous stock exchanges have sprung up in China and Eastern Europe, 16 in the former USSR alone. And a new class of investors, speculators, and racketeers are wallowing in wealth. The professed goal is no longer to provide a better life for all citizens, but to maximize the opportunities for individuals to accumulate personal fortunes. More opulence for the few creates more poverty for the many. As one young female journalist in Russia put it, quote, every time someone gets richer, I get poorer. In Russia, the living standard of the average family has fallen almost by half since the market reforms took hold. A report from Hungary makes the same point, quote, while the new rich, quote-unquote, live in villas and a Mercedes-Benz in the garage, the number of poor people has been growing. As socialist Vietnam opens itself to foreign investment and the free market, quote-unquote, gaps between the rich and the poor have widened rapidly, and the quality of education and healthcare for the poor has deteriorated. Prosperity has come, quote, only to a privileged few in Vietnam, leading to an emerging class structure that is at odds with the country's professed egalitarian ideals. In the emerging free market paradise of Russia and Eastern Europe, price deregulation produced not competitive prices, but prices set by private monopolies, adding to the galloping inflation. Remind you of this country at all right now? Beggars, pimps, dope pushers, and other hustlers ply their trades as never before, and there has been a dramatic rise in unemployment, homelessness, air and water pollution, prostitution, spousal abuse, child abuse, and just about every other social ill. In countries like Russia and Hungary, as widely reported in the U.S. press, the suicide rate has climbed by 50% in a few years. That's something else that's happening in the United States and nobody's talking about, particularly amongst the young. During COVID, there was some ridiculous numbers that came out. I believe it was from the CDC, but don't quote me. I think it was the CDC's numbers showing that 1 out of every 4 of Gen Z contemplated suicide during COVID, and it was 1 out of every 3 for people that was under the age of 18. So basically, millennials and Gen Z contemplate suicide at a much higher rate than the boomers, who are more like 1 out of 11. That's very sad, and that's not just because of COVID. That's also because of the deteriorating circumstances that those people have to grow up in. Not just infrastructure, but their prospects for jobs and getting married and having a house and a working vehicle and taking care of your family and keeping your bills paid are very grim for the young in this country. It's very sad. Reductions in fuel service brought about by rising prices and unpaid bills have led to a growing number of deaths or serious illnesses among the poor and the elderly during long winters. In Russia, doctors and nurses in public clinics are now grossly underpaid. Free health clinics are closing. More than ever, hospitals suffer from unsanitary conditions and shortages of disposable syringes, needles, vaccines, and modern equipment. Many hospitals now do not have hot water. Some have no water at all. The deterioration of immunization programs and health standards has allowed the polio to make a serious comeback, along with tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria, dysentery, and sexually transmitted diseases. Drug addiction has risen sharply. Quote, Russia's hospitals are struggling to treat increasing numbers of addicts with decreasing levels of funding. It's according to CNN in 92. Remember, this book came out in 1997, so it's a 25-year-old book. A lot of these things have changed. Most of these things have changed for the worse. There has been a decline in nutritional levels and a sharp increase in stress and illness. Yet the number of visits to doctors has dropped by half because fees are so costly in the newly privatized healthcare systems. As a result, many illnesses go undetected and untreated until they become critical. Russian military officials describe the health of conscripts as catastrophic. Within the armed forces, suicides have risen dramatically and deaths from drug overdoses have climbed 80% in recent years, according to the Toronto Star in 95. The overthrow of communism brought a rising infant mortality rate and soaring death rates in Russia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Latvia, Moldavia, Romania, Ukraine, Mongolia, and East Germany. 1/3 of Russian men never lived to see the age of 60. In 1992, Russia's birth rate fell below its death rate for the first time since World War II. In 92 and 93, East Germans buried 2 people for every baby born. The death rate rose nearly 20% for East German women in their late 30s and nearly 30% for men at the same age. With the end of subsidized rents, estimates of homelessness in Moscow alone run as high as 300,000. Now, I have no idea if that's still accurate again. Some of this stuff has changed. I have no idea if that's still accurate. The loss of resident permits deprives and the homeless of medical care and other state benefits such as they are. Dressed in rags and victimized by both mobsters and government militia, thousands of indigents die of cold and hunger on the streets of various cities. In Romania, thousands of homeless children live in the sewers and train stations, sniffing glue to numb their hunger and begging and falling prey to various predators. In Mongolia, hundreds of homeless children live in the sewers of Ulaanbaatar. Before 1990, Mongolia was a prosperous nation that had benefited from Soviet and East European financial assistance and technical aid. Its new industrial centers produced leather goods, woolen products, textiles, cement, meat, grain, and timber. Quote, the communist era dramatically improved the quality of life of the people, achieving commendable levels of social development through state-sponsored social welfare measures. But free market privatization and deindustrialization has brought unemployment, mass poverty, and widespread malnutrition to Mongolia. Shock therapy for the many. Unemployment rates have risen as high as 30% in countries that once knew full employment under communism. One Polish worker claims that the jobless are pretty much unemployable after the age of 40. Polish women say economic demise comes earlier for them, since to get a job, as one puts it, quote, you must be young, childless, and have a big bosom. Occupational safety is now almost non-existent and workplace injuries and deaths have drastically increased. Workers now toil harder for longer, for less, often in sweatshop conditions. Teachers, scientists, factory workers, and countless others struggle for months without pay as their employers run out of funds. The waves of strikes and work stoppages in Russia and Eastern Europe are accorded unsympathetic press treatment in those countries. Sounds a lot like America right here. Every time we hit the streets and protest, the press doesn't cover it, and if they cover it in a way that's detrimental to the protesters. They call them looters or they call them violent. You pick out, if there's a big protest where 99.9% of the people protesting are peaceful, the press in this country goes and focuses on the 0.1% that's throwing bricks through windows and then says they're violent, and then they focus on how the police needed to beat the shit out of a bunch of protesters. That's how it goes in our country. And if that doesn't change pretty soon, I think that 99% that is peaceful is going to start to change their mind. I think that they're going to start to get more and more destructive the more we are denied rights and denied basic, fundamental rights to health care and education and food in this country. But I digress. Even in the few remaining countries in which communist governments remain in control, such as China, Vietnam, and Cuba, the opening to private investment has contributed to a growing inequality. In Cuba, the dollar economy has brought with it a growth in prostitution, including girls as young as 11 and 12, street beggars, and black market dealings with tourists. In China, there are workers who now put in 12 to 16-hour days for subsistence pay without regularly getting a day off. Those who protest against poor safety and health conditions risk being fired or jailed. The market reforms in China have also brought a return to child labor, according to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1990. Quote, "I think this is what happens when you have private companies," says Mrs. Peng, a young migrant who has doubts about the new China. Quote, "In private companies, the workers don't have any rights." Throughout Eastern Europe, unions have been greatly weakened or broken. Sick leave, maternity leave, paid vacations, and other job benefits once taken for granted under communism have been cut or abolished. Worker sanitariums, vacation resorts, health clinics, sports and cultural centers, children's nurseries, daycare centers, and other features that made communist enterprises more than just workplaces have nearly vanished. Rest homes formerly reserved for workers have been privatized and turned into casinos, nightclubs, and restaurants for the nouveau riche. Real income has shrunk by as much as 30 to 40% in the ex-communist countries. In 1992 alone, Russia saw its consumer spending drop by 38%. By comparison, during the Great Depression, consumer spending in the United States fell just 21% over 4 years. In both Poland and Bulgaria, an estimated 70% now live just above or below the poverty line. In Russia, it is 75 to 85%, with a third of the population barely subsisting in absolute economic desperation. In Hungary, which has received most of the West's investment in Eastern Europe, over 1/3 of its citizens now live in abject poverty, and 70% of the men hold 2 or more jobs, working up to 14 hours a day, according to the Ministry of Labor. Again, that sounds very much like America right this very second. After months of not getting paid, coal miners in the far eastern Russia were beginning to starve. By August of 1996, 10,000 of them had stopped working simply because they were too weak from hunger. With no coal being extracted, the region's power plants began to shut down, threatening electrical blackouts that would further harm the nation's Pacific coastal industry and trade. Eastern Europeans are witnessing scenes that are quote-unquote commonplace enough in the West, but are still wrenching here. The old man rummaging through the trash barrels for castaway items, the old woman picking through a box of bones at a meat market in search of one with enough gristle to make a thin soup. With their savings and pensions swallowed up by inflation, elderly pensioners crowd the sidewalks of Moscow selling articles of their own clothing and other pathetic wares, while enduring harassment by police and thugs. A Russian senior citizen refers to this poverty which only a few have escaped, while some have become wildly rich. Crime and corruption. These next two sections are the most important parts, in my opinion, of this chapter that I've read so far. Crime and corruption. With the socialist ethic giving way to private greed, corruption assumed virulent new forms in the post-communist nations. Officials high and low are on the take, including the police. The Russian security minister calculated that 1/3 of Russian oil and 1/2 of Russian nickel shipped out of the country was stolen. Among those quote-unquote enjoying staggering profits from this plunder were Shell Oil and British Petroleum. That's according to WAPO in 1993. In April 92, the chairman of Russia's central bank admitted that at least $20 billion had been illegally taken out of the country and deposited in Western banks. Choice chunks of public real estate are quietly sold off at fraction of their value in exchange for payoffs to the officials who preside over the sales. Government officials buy goods from private contractors at twice the normal price in exchange for kickbacks. Factory directors sell state-made commodities at low state prices to their own private firms, which those firms then resell at market prices for a vast profit. One member of the Moscow City Council estimated that corruption amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars. If these funds went into state coffers instead of private pockets, quote, we could meet our budget 3 or 4 times over, according to the LA Times of 1992. Along with corruption, there is an upsurge in organized crime. Over 100 racket syndicates in Russia now extort tribute from 80% of all enterprises. From 92 to 95, as competition for the spoils of reform intensified, 46 of Russia's more prominent businessmen were slain in gangland-style murders. In 94, there were more than 2,500 contract murders, almost all of them unsolved. Quote, contract murders occur regularly now in Russia, and most go without much notice. Police say they lack the funds, personnel, and crime detection equipment for any real campaign against the mobs. Street crime has also increased sharply. In the former Soviet Union, women and elderly who once felt free to sit in parks late at night now dare not venture out after dark. Since the overthrow of communism in Hungary, thefts and other felonies have nearly tripled, and there has been a 50% increase in homicides. The police force in Prague today is many times greater than it was under communism, when, quote, relatively few police were actually needed. How odd that fewer police were needed in the communist police state than in the free market paradise. That is odd, isn't it? In the Republic of Georgia, life has been reduced to a level of violent chaos never imagined under communism. Criminal rings control much of the commerce, and paramilitary groups control most of the criminal rings. No longer able to sell its goods on the Soviet market, but unable to compete on the international market, Georgian industry has experienced a massive decline, and, as in most Eastern countries, the public debt has leapt upward, while real wages have shrunk painfully. Cultural decay. This is the other really important part. Cultural life has drastically declined in the former communist countries too. Theaters are sparsely attended because tickets are now prohibitively expensive. Publicly owned movie industries in countries like Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the German Democratic Republic, which produced a number of worthwhile films, have been defunded or bought out by Western business interests and now make cartoons, commercials, and music videos. Movie houses have been taken over by corporate chains and offer many of the same Hollywood junk films that we have the freedom to see. Now, like I said, it's not the most important part, but you'll notice that this is similar to what's going on now. You know, one of the ways that they keep us distracted from all of this capitalist chaos in this country is by just investing a ton of money into trash propaganda Hollywood films in this country, which come out 10 a day. I mean, you couldn't possibly watch everything that comes out on Netflix. You'd have 10 lifetimes to watch all of the movies that are available on Amazon Prime or Netflix at this very moment. That's just bread and circuses to keep everybody distracted from what they're doing to us in this country. But I digress again. Subsidies for the arts and literature have been severely cut. Symphony orchestras have disbanded or taken to playing at block parties and other minor occasions. The communist countries used to produce inexpensive but quality editions of classical and contemporary authors and poets, including ones from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. These have been replaced by second-rate mass-market publications from the West. During the communist era, 3 of every 5 books in the world were produced in the Soviet Union. Today, as the cost of books, periodicals, and newspapers has skyrocketed and education has declined, readership has shrunk almost to third-world levels. Pay attention to this next part here. Books of a Marxist or otherwise critical left perspective have been removed from bookstores and libraries. In East Germany, the Writers Association reported that one instance in which 50,000 tons of books, some brand new, were buried in a dump. The German authorities who disposed of the books apparently did not feel quite free enough to burn them. Education, once free, is now accessible only to those who can afford the costly tuition rates. The curricula have been quote-unquote depoliticized, meaning that a left perspective critical of imperialism and capitalism has been replaced by a conservative one that is supportive or at least uncritical of these forces. Descending upon the unhappy societies of Eastern Europe and Russia are the Hare Krishnas, the Mormons, Moonies, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baha'is, rightist Christian evangelicals, self-improvement hucksters, instant success peddlers, and other materialistic, spiritualistic scavengers who prey upon the deprived and the desperate, offering solace in the next world or the promise of wealth and success in this one. The president of one of Russia's largest construction companies summed it all up, quote, "All the material well-being that people had, they lost in 1 hour. There is practically no more free medical care, accessible higher education, no right to a job or rest. The houses of culture, libraries, stadiums, kindergartens, and nurseries, pioneer camps, schools, hospitals, and stores are closing. The cost of housing, communal services, and transport are no longer affordable for the majority of families." Facing forced privatization, news and entertainment media have had to find rich owners, corporate advertisers, conservative foundations, or agencies within the newly installed capitalist governments to finance them. Television and radio programs that had a left perspective, including some popular youth shows, have been removed from the air. All media have been purged of leftists and restaffed by people with acceptable ideological orientations. This process of moving towards a pro-capitalist communication monopoly has been described in the Western media as democratization. Billboards and television commercials promoting U.S. cigarettes, automobiles, and other consumer items, many of them beyond the average pocketbook, can now be seen everywhere. We'll finish up the rest of that chapter next episode, guys. I have 3 other episodes as well that I'll try to get out to you over the week. So keep fighting that good fight out there. And that last part we just read, the democratization of media in this country, which really is just replacing all of the lefty voices with pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist voices. That's important to make note of because that's what I'm trying to fight on this channel and what most of my indie network friends that do the same thing I do are trying to fight against. We're trying to make sure that there is lefty voices out there that fight against imperialism and capitalism, and we must work together because otherwise they're going to wipe us out. There's strength in numbers, so we must keep doing what we're doing. We will grow in numbers, we will grow in viewership, and eventually we'll be able to fight off this sort of like democratization of media. We have no choice. As the capitalist system that we're fighting against right now sort of collapses before our eyes, it's going to get more and more violent against us. It's going to be much more censorship than we're used to, and the only way we're going to survive it is if we work together. So keep fighting that good fight out there, guys. I'll read to you the rest of the chapter either later today or tomorrow. See ya.